to figure out how to get the council and our advisory bodies briefed on the Oregon draft wind energy areas, which were announced fairly recently. We did not have thanks for starting the recording. We did not have an MPC Marine Planning Committee meeting scheduled, and so we were, sort of scrambling to figure out how to get the word out. And this meeting was an obvious choice because it was already noticed, it was already scheduled, and so this is going to, even though this is not the Marine Planning Committee, this is going to be the main briefing opportunity. And so I'm happy to see a number of other advisory bodies joining me here today. Like Jesse said, it's being recorded and we'll post it to this meeting webpage. We did then subsequently schedule a marine planning meeting for this Friday in the afternoon. We tacked on to a pre-existing GAP meeting. And, the reason we had to sort of scramble and we had to join the GAP meeting is because of Federal Register notification requirements. We didn't have enough time in advance. So anyway, that's what we're doing. But just to be clear, this is the main briefing. It is informational. Please do ask clarifying questions, technical questions, that sort of thing. During this briefing and in the Q&A for it, it's not the chance to develop comments on it or offer opinions or that sort of thing. It's really just to get clarity on the nuts and bolts, the analysis, the data, that sort of thing. We will revisit this again on Friday, but there won't be a full-on briefing. But we will, I think Jessica Carlton is the presenter for today, and I think she's able to join us, but she's also on the East Coast. So we're not going to ask her to spend her entire Friday evening on our MPC meeting. But there's my general overview, and I think what I'd like to do is basically we're a little bit ahead of schedule, so I want to make sure, thank you, Jesse, for posting the link to Friday's meeting. I guess first off, I want to confirm, or maybe I'll just turn it over to our BOEM and our NCCOS partners here. I saw Jennifer Miller and Jessica and Ingrid Biedron. You guys are all on, so, and I've made you all three moderators so you can share slides. So I think what I'll do now, unless there's some overall questions, is maybe turn it over to our BOEM and NCCOS guests and let you guys take it away. So you can unmute yourself and you should be able to share your slides.
Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Miller. I'll start out. My name is, as I mentioned, my name is Jennifer Miller, and I'm the chief of the renewable energy section here in BOEM's Pacific region. I'll be speaking today, as Carrie mentioned, about the Oregon draft wind energy areas, providing some information and, here to answer any questions that you guys have. I'm going to go over some of the background information, and then Jessica from the National Coastal Center for Ocean Sciences will speak a little bit more about the suitability model that was used in our development of the draft wind energy areas. But I don't know if Jessica or if Ingrid want to do introductions. I'll allow you guys.
Sure, thanks, Jen. This is Ingrid Biedron from BOEM. Just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity for us to present today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica if she wants to say anything.
Thanks, Jen and Ingrid. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Carlton. I was the GIS analyst from NCCOS on the Marine Spatial Planning team that led the modeling effort for the Oregon WIAs. And so thank you for having us today and looking forward to presenting some information to you. I'll send it back to Jen.
All right, thanks, Ingrid and Jessica. And so as Carrie mentioned, we're here to talk a little bit about the draft wind energy areas. And we are very grateful and want to thank the PFMC's Coastal Pelagic Species Advisory Subpanel and Carrie Griffin for inviting and allowing us to present today. As mentioned, this was a bit last minute, and we're just really great to be able to, provide this information in a timely manner so that you guys can have some discussions and an opportunity to provide feedback. Okay. figure out how to change my slides really quickly. Hold on. Hold on. Okay. Okay. See if it'll work now. All right. Here we go. Okay. You guys can see all the slides, I'm assuming. We're on slide 2 of the agenda. Okay. And so this presentation, as I mentioned, is to provide a summary of the planning process approach that has been used in Oregon. I'm going to go over real quickly the development of the call areas, some feedback we received from the call for information and nominations, and then Jessica's going to provide quite a bit of detailed information on the suitability modeling process that was used in development of the draft wind energy areas. And then we're going to wrap up the presentation with some information on potential next steps in the offshore wind authorization process. And so to start out, this is a slide that really goes over our approach for offshore wind energy planning in Oregon, which was founded on data gathering and engagement. At the beginning, BOEM and DLCD and the task force developed a data gathering and engagement plan, and then BOEM and DLCD worked together to create the ORO wind map to make the data that was used in the planning process publicly available. Since 2020, we've done extensive outreach to gather data, collect information, share information on the offshore wind authorization process with the public, tribal governments, stakeholders such as yourselves, along with the state of Oregon and our federal and state agency partners. BOEM has used and continues to use scientific studies, spatial analysis modeling, along with feedback from tribal governments, stakeholders, the state of Oregon, and the federal and state agencies to support informed decision-making and publish the call for information and nominations in the Federal Register in April of 2022. The call for information and nominations included 2 call areas, and then most recently we published a request for comments that was published for 2 draft wind energy areas on August 15th. And so this is, so as I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about our planning process and how it started. And, really the planning process started with the identification of a planning area. This was one of the first decisions made by the task force area, and it has to do with, like, where are we going to start looking for sea space for Oregon, to start planning for offshore wind. And the planning area included the entire Oregon outer continental shelf where offshore wind is technically viable. And technically viable, from our understanding, meant that the area was at least 3 nautical miles off the coast, which makes it federal waters where BOEM has jurisdiction. Where the wind speeds were greater than 7 meters per second, which is the entire Oregon coast, and then where water depths were shallower than 1,300 meters or a little over 4,200 feet. The 1,300 meter water depth limit was decided as the technical limit for economic and technical viability for floating offshore wind, based on our understanding of the time and, really development in, what we consider to be the near term, which would be like the 2030s time range. The 1,300, I think it's worth noting that the deepest installed floating offshore wind is only in about 300 meters of water depth. Now we've heard quite a bit about 1,300 meters offshore Oregon. We've received some comments, asking if it's possible to, simply shift into slightly deeper waters. And, in Oregon, that's not really possible due to the shape of the continental shelf and slope off Oregon. The shelf is very, very steep and extends out to about 1,300 to 1,000 meters water depth, at which point it gets very, very steep and continues out to almost 3,000 meters water depth. Now these steep slopes that you see here that really go from like around that 1,000 meters to 3,000 meters water depth, those slopes are too steep to allow for any kind of facility development or construction of this type of nature. And so the if we did try to move the areas further to the west, we would really be looking at the flat areas that are in about 3,000 meters water depth or about 10,000 feet. So as we, continue to collect information to develop the call areas, some of the data that we used in the development of the call areas includes a pushback from 3 to 12 nautical miles from the coast. Now, this was done to reduce visual and environmental impacts. A lot of the most productive waters are those coastal waters right close to the shelf. So that was one of the first things that we did in the development of the call areas. Again, we looked at the 1,300 meter water depth contour as our western boundary. We considered wind speed, which goes into the levelized cost of energy, which is, how much is that energy going to cost? We considered that in the development of the call areas. We also considered paleo shorelines. Now you'll see that on this map in those gold to red colors that extend from the coast. And what that means is we underwent a study. We took on a study to look at where the shelf was exposed during previous low stands for sea level, and so areas that may have been exposed and may have been inhabited by tribal nations. We worked to try and avoid those paleo shorelines to the best of our ability. We also avoided undersea canyons. Not only do they contain sensitive environmental communities, but they have those steep slopes that make development really not practical. We avoided the crabber tug and tow lanes, as we understand those are key and very important to mariners. And we also did our best to avoid the vast majority of undersea cables. You can see in this image, there is one cable that runs through the northern Coos Bay call area. We also considered fishing quite a bit when we were thinking about where the call areas should be developed. We considered the VMS data to understand where commercial fishing is taking place off the coast. And here is, just one slide with some examples of the VMS data that we considered. So BOEM collected and analyzed all this data, and then on February 25th, 2022, we proposed 3 call areas off of Oregon in that task force meeting. Based on feedback that we received after this task force meeting, we removed one of those call areas, and then on April 29th, 2022, BOEM published the call for information and nominations in the Federal Register that included the Coos Bay and Brookings call areas. There was a 60-day comment period, and we received 278 unique comments and 4 nominations of interest. We've heard some consistent themes throughout our data collection and engagement efforts, and the themes include interest in learning more about visual impacts from offshore wind farms, impacts to cultural resources and Native American lifeways, the role and need for offshore wind energy as part of Oregon's energy portfolio, including ratepayer costs, economic impacts and opportunities, things like jobs, tourism, and shoreside infrastructure, socioeconomic impacts to fishing activities, long-term impacts on the livelihood of fishers and other ocean users, potential environmental impacts, including noise impacts and the disruption of species behavior and migration patterns on marine species, birds, and other wildlife. We've also heard support for continual and meaningful engagement with potentially affected and interested users, especially ocean users, throughout all phases of offshore wind development. BOEM has been continually working to improve our process and respond to the feedback that we get at each step along the way. Specific to feedback on continual and meaningful engagement with potentially affected and interested users, especially ocean users, BOEM has added the draft wind energy area step to allow for additional opportunity for input from tribal nations, stakeholders such as yourselves, the public, and our federal and state agency partners. This includes G2G consultation, additional engagement opportunities, additional data collection efforts, BOEM-funded studies, and the use of the NCCOS spatial suitability modeling that Jessica will dive into in just a second. We've also increased our outreach discussions and opportunities for input with the fishing industry and different sectors. We've conducted a visualization simulation to try and get an understanding of potential visual impacts. And we've provided information on the draft wind energy areas to tribal nations prior to publication. We've created a full-time tribal liaison position in BOEM's Pacific office. And we continue to listen and respond to the best of our ability. And with that, we will get on to the spatial modeling results.
All right, thanks, Jen. If you could just go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start here with a quick overview of the marine spatial planning process, just to refresh everyone on the suitability modeling process and some of our methods. So a suitability model is the model that weights locations relative to each other based on given criteria, for instance, sensitivity to offshore wind development. To the right is the spatial planning workflow that was developed for the Oregon WEA model and contains the logical steps taken in the modeling process. Data used in a model must be transformed into a common scale so they can be compared. So here we are using a scale of 0 to 1, where 0 means non-compatible with offshore wind and 1 means highly compatible. This approach allows us to analyze data together within the whole ecosystem and identifies hotspots of both conflict and opportunity. In addition, these methods allow us to run scenarios where we can run the model using different weights and scores for the data inputs. Next slide. So here's a high-level view of how this suitability model was constructed and how data were organized. One of the early steps in the workflow is stakeholder engagement and data inventory. We rely on agencies and groups, like ones on the left, to help identify the best available data for the call areas. The data that are selected are then grouped into submodels by categories chosen by BOEM. So for Oregon, we have 5 submodels: the constraints, industry and operations, fisheries, wind, and natural resources. The data are then placed onto a 10-acre hexagonal grid created for the call areas. For each submodel, the geometric mean was calculated for each grid cell using the assigned scores for each of the data layers. The areas identified in the constraint submodel are eliminated from consideration, and the remaining submodels are equally weighted, and the geometric mean is calculated, which results in a final suitability score for each grid cell. Next slide. So keep in mind that we're using different types of spatial data in the model, categorical and continuous. When transforming data to the 0 to 1 scale, categorical data are assigned scores based on their compatibility with offshore wind development. For continuous data, such as fishing and vessel traffic, we use mathematical functions like the Z membership function that assigns a score between 0 to 1 based on the spread of the data. So when we look at the scores for each data set in the model, you'll see a single score for categorical data, like in this table. And for continuous data, you'll see the function that was used to transform that data set and the range of values that were assigned to the data. Next slide. And one last thing I wanted to mention before moving on is the use of combined data layers in suitability modeling. The Oregon WEA model used multiple combined data layers, which we'll see in just a few minutes, that were developed to group certain data within submodels by topic. So this is a method that is being used in some of our other marine spatial planning models and provides an additional opportunity for stakeholder engagement. A combined data layer is created by taking multiple layers and then calculating a suitability score for that combined data layer to be used in the model. And so this is just an example on the screen looking at the protected species combined layer that was created with our colleagues at NEMS for use in the Gulf of Mexico AOA analysis. And so by combining these different species layers, we can identify hotspots of marine mammal activity and other sensitive areas for protected species. Next slide. Now this table shows the data inputs for the Oregon suitability model organized by submodel, and then showing the setback or buffer distance if one was used, and then the score that was applied to each layer. And so next we'll dive into each of these submodels and look at the data and relative suitability results for each. Next slide. So first we're going to look at the constraint submodel. So constraints are data layers for areas that are likely to limit wind energy development, and this submodel contained 2 data layers. Next slide. Here on the left, we have the exclusion area that was provided by the Department of Defense as being incompatible with wind energy development due to a conflict with national security. And this layer alone constrains about 50% of the call areas. And then the next is a proposed fairway zone that was provided by the U.S. Coast Guard as part of the Pacific Coast Port Access Route Study. And this area was considered a navigational constraint for vessel traffic. So this data layer alone constrained about 18% of the call areas. Next slide. These are the results for the constraint submodel. So the region in red is the area that is constrained, and the suitable areas for wind energy are in blue, which can move forward in the suitability analysis. And so overall, the constraints resulted in a 57.59% reduction in the call areas. Next slide. So next we'll look at the industry and operations submodel. This submodel had 2 data layers. Next slide. First, we have the NMCS Scientific Surveys combined layer, which was a collaboration with NMCS's Northwest and Southwest Fisheries Science Center. This combined data layer consists of 4 single data layers that represent the geospatial extent of NMCS survey operations within the call areas. NMCS recommended 2 scoring approaches for this data layer, one of which you see here in the map on the left. This approach was selected because it did not contain areas that would be assigned as a constraint. And so in the final combined layer shown, we have 8 4 nautical mile wide corridors that were given a lower suitability score than the remaining area. Next are the submarine cables. There's only 1 cable in the region that passes through the Coos Bay call area. This data layer was given a 500 and 1,000 meter setback due to the potential interactions with this industry. And so the 500 meter setback was given a score of 0.6, and the 1,000 meter setback was given a score of 0.8. Next slide. These are the results for the industry and operations submodel. So you can see the lowest relative suitability scores that are in shades of orange, and then areas with a relatively higher suitability in greens and blues. Next slide. So here we have the natural resources submodel, and this submodel contains 3 different combined data layers. Next slide. First, we have the NMCS protected species combined layer, which was a collaboration with NMCS's West Coast region. This combined layer consists of 5 species data layers that were identified by NMCS as being highly vulnerable to wind energy development within the call areas and are either listed under the Endangered Species Act or Marine Mammal Protection Act. NCCOS recommended scoring approaches for this data layer, and the one shown was selected for the model because it did not contain areas that would be placed in the constraint submodel. The relative suitability scores for this data layer are shown on the map, and the areas identified as being least suitable for offshore wind development shown in shades of orange to yellow. Next slide. Next is the NCCOS Habitat Combined Data Layer, which was also a collaboration within NCCOS's West Coast region and the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. This combined data layer consists of 5 habitat types listed here on the left that were selected by NCCOS and ranked based on their potential sensitivity to offshore wind energy development. NCCOS recommended scoring approaches for this data layer, assigning the most sensitive habitats with the lowest scores. The scoring approach shown here on the map was used within the model because it did not contain areas with constraints. Next slide. Last, for the natural resources submodel, is the marine bird combined data layer, which was a collaboration between NCCOS, BOEM, and the U.S. Geological Survey. This data layer utilized existing modeled relative density data for 30 individual species, as well as 12 taxonomic groups. So each species or group was assigned a vulnerability rating based on its sensitivity to offshore wind development within the call areas. And then bringing all those data together resulted in a single combined layer seen here in the map. And this data layer is a continuous data set ranging in values from low marine bird importance to high marine bird importance. So these data were rescaled using the Z membership function for use within the model with scores that ranged from 0.01 to 1. Next slide. And so this is just a recap of the 3 data layers in the natural resources submodel. And so the 3 of these were then equally weighted and combined using the geometric mean. Next slide. And so these are the results for the natural resources submodel. Again, we're given a range of relative suitability from high to low, with the lowest relative suitability scores in shades of orange in areas with a higher relative suitability in greens and blues. Next slide. Here is the fisheries submodel. This submodel contains the NMFS and ODF&W fisheries combined data layer. That's okay, you can go to the next slide. And so this data layer was a collaboration between NMFS and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. It consists of 9 fisheries shown on the screen, and then utilizes both fishing effort and revenue data when available. These fisheries were weighted equally and combined in a single layer, which you see here in the map. And then NMFS and ODF&W recommended 5 different scoring approaches for this data layer. The approach that was selected for the model took 75% of the area that the 4 trawl fisheries operate within and scored that area with a 0.001, which is shown on the map in dark orange. This scoring approach was selected because it was the most conservative approach that did not contain constraints. Next slide. And so here are the relative suitability results for the fisheries submodel. Since there was only one data input for this submodel, it retains the suitability scores from the NMFS and ODF&W fisheries combined layer to be used in the final suitability calculation. Next slide. Last is the wind submodel. This submodel consists of one data input, which is the levelized cost of energy. Next slide. The levelized cost of energy is a cost model product that was developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that shows the cost of floating offshore wind for Oregon. For this data layer, the lower the cost of energy, the better for offshore wind. So the lower areas, which are those lower areas that are in darker blues and purple on the map? For the model, this layer was rescaled from 0.8 to 1 using a linear function because we're assuming that as the cost of energy increases, the suitability of offshore wind decreases. Next slide. Here we have the relative suitability results for the wind submodel, with the relatively lower areas in Coos Bay and the higher suitability areas in blue in Brookings and lower Coos Bay. Next slide, please. To recap, here are the results from all 5 submodels. These are then combined by equally weighting each submodel, except for the constraints, and then using the geometric mean to get a final suitability score for each grid cell within the CAW areas. Next slide. So here's the resulting heat map of the final suitability results. Areas in red are those from the constraint submodel that were determined to be incompatible with wind. The remaining areas range from lower suitability in orange to higher suitability in blues. And so next we take these suitability scores. We remove the grid cells with a score of 0 that were in the constraint submodel, and then run a cluster analysis. Next slide, please. So displayed in the map here are the cluster analysis results. These are what we call high clusters because they contain statistically significant grid cells from the relatively highest suitability areas. And so we use these clusters and a set of rules or guidelines to then identify the WIA options. And so first, BOEM's aliquots are overlaid on top of these high clusters. Then the aliquots that intersect with a grid cell that contains a high cluster is selected and extracted. Then the groups of aliquots that are less than 55,000 acres are removed. And then in cases where there may be holes within these remaining groups, the missing aliquots were included, but only if they were fully encircled by high clusters or those original selected aliquots. So next slide, please. And so these are the result for the 2 draft wind energy areas. So we end up with one WIA A in Coos Bay, and then WIA B in Brookings. And so these last few slides are what we call characterization and model performance. So it's basically a review of the data layers that went into the model, and as well as you can look at other data layers that can be useful for providing further intelligence for decision makers. So I'm just going to flip through the next few slides here real quick. Next slide. So here's a look at the NIMP Scientific Survey's combined data layer in relation to the draft WIAs.
I tried.
Next slide. Here are the draft VIAs overlaid with the NMFS protected species combined data layer used in the natural resources submodel. Next slide. Here's the NMFS habitat combined data layer used in the natural resources submodel in relation to the draft WIAs. Next slide. This is the marine bird combined data layer showing marine bird importance. Next slide. This is the NMFS and ODF&W fisheries combined data layer that was used for the fisheries submodel in relation to the draft WIAs. Next slide. And then this is VMS data for all fishing types from 2010 to 2021 in relation to the draft WIAs. And so this is one of those additional data layers that wasn't used in the model, but can help us understand and characterize the area. Next slide. And with that, I'll send it back over to Jen.
Thank you, Jessica. And so now I'll just present a few slides on next steps in the renewable energy authorization process. So as Jessica mentioned, we published the draft wind energy areas for Oregon. There's draft wind energy area A, which is within the Coos Bay Call area. It is just over 61,000 acres, and we've estimated its potential at 740 megawatts. It's 32 miles to shore at its nearest point and approximately 40 miles to the port of Coos Bay. And then there's draft wind energy area B, which is located in the Brookings Call area. It's just over 158,000 acres. It's estimated to produce approximately 1.9 gigawatts of energy, or 1,920 megawatts. It's 18 miles to shore at its closest point and 23 miles to the port of Brookings. And next steps in BOEM's wind energy authorization process include the comment period for the draft wind energy areas that were just published on BOEM's website for public comment. It's a 60-day public comment period and will close on October 16th. Comments are made through regulations.gov, docket number BOEM-2023-0033. And there are supporting documents available on the BOEM website. I believe Susan Chambers put the link to the website in the chat, and it includes not only the request for comments on the draft wind energy areas, but the completed visual simulations, the draft modeling report that was developed by NCCOS, and then maps and shapefiles of the draft wind energy areas. We're holding some engagement meetings this week here today at the Coastal Pelagic Species Advisory Subpanel meeting. As mentioned, we're going to be available for Q&A on Friday at the Marine Planning Committee meeting. And then we are currently working on some upcoming engagement opportunities, including BOEM will be in person at the September 11th PFMC Council meeting, the general session on September 18th. We're hosting the task force meeting for Oregon, and then we are currently planning a fishing industry informational webinar and 3 in-person public meetings in coastal Oregon, and we continue our consultation with the tribes. And then, I'm sure everybody's probably seen this slide before. So this is the rainbow slide, and, just to sort of give yourself a little orientation on where we would be in the process. You can see in the planning and analysis that is on the far left-hand side, in those brown and dark brown to black colors, we are currently in that area identification phase, which is after the call. This slide was developed before we had the draft wind energy area, which significantly lengthens that area identification stage. We published the call a little over a year and a half ago, and so that's where we are right now as far as the overall process. And the next steps would really be potentially identifying wind energy areas, and then moving forward with publishing potential leasing notices. And with that, I think that ends our presentation. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. We really appreciate it. And I guess now we'll take any questions that anybody has.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer and Jessica. Appreciate it. This is Carrie. Jesse had to step away for a second, so I will be your Jessie for a little bit until she rejoins us. I think and Jesse, if you're already back, just tell me to shut up. Feel free. So I think the plan here, since this is CPSAS meeting, first and foremost, we're going to give priority to any CPSAS members for Q&A. And then I think the next level would be for other council advisory bodies. I think there is an opportunity for public comment a little later in today's agenda at 11:40. That said, if there's time during, we have almost a half an hour before the next agenda item. So if there's no questions from the CPSAS or other advisory bodies, then we can take questions from the public. So anyway, that's our tiered priorities. So starting with CPSAS, if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. It's in the little smiley face down at the bottom of the screen. You click it, and then you'll see the raised hand button. And I see the first hand up. Mark Fina, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I just have a question on how you modeled the fishery information. I think you said that all fisheries are weighted equally, and I'm just wondering what that means. I mean, does equal mean by value or by total catch is one in a fishery? And then I just, that could mean an awful lot of different things. And then you just sum them to come up with your value of the fishery index, or I'm just curious what you did there.
Right. So it just means that one fishery in that data layer wasn't given more weight in the model over another fishery. So sorry.
I guess you're kind of getting to my question, which is that, I haven't looked at the values of these fisheries or anything, or the values in the areas, but you could have a fishery that's, super highly valued in an area and another fishery that has minimal value in the area, and they would be equally weighted. Or did you use tonnage? Or, I just don't understand what you mean by equally weighting, unless you mean, I guess that's the question, is equal with respect to what, and how that gets translated into the modeling.
Right. Okay. So first, I would encourage you to look at the NIMS and ODF&W technical assistance document that they provided with the data when they did the handover for us to use their data in the model, because it thoroughly explains their methods and how the data were treated in that data layer. So that I think there should be a link to the presentation that they gave the council this past early spring. It should be on the website somewhere. We can point you in the right direction for that. But then there's also an appendix in the NCCOS report that contains that technical assistance document with their methods and things. But just like a quick overview of what was done with the data. So for each fisheries, so there was 9 fisheries that were used in there, and effort and revenue data were combined to give a ranked importance value for each of those fisheries. And so it was that ranked importance value that was combined and equally weighted in the data layer. So
Okay, I see the appendix now.
Okay, yeah. So if you have any additional questions about any of that, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to our NIMS colleagues that are on that appendix, and they can help answer any additional questions. And then feel free to contact me too later if there's something else that needs to be clarified.
Thanks.
Okay, Mike Okaneski, go ahead.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. Thank you for the presentation. That was helpful. And I would like to get this over quickly from my part so we can get some of the audience to ask questions if it so desire. The first one is Oregon, the state of Oregon, from the governor's office, asked to put a pause on this going ahead with the WEAs, as I understand. And I guess, or how is that reconciled right now is one of the questions. Or, I mean, is there an understanding between BOEM and the governor's office at this point that allowed you, without concern about the governor's opinion on the whole thing, to go forward? And maybe you could explain that a little bit. But also the other one, there's been a lot of talk from a lot of people in the fishing industry, as well as in the environmental community and some of the tribes, about the ecological effects of wind turbines, wind farms, and what it would mean like to forces, hydrological forces such as upwelling and whatnot, and how that would play out with the existing ecology and support systems for, I guess, basically all the life or a large part of it in the California ecosystem. And I haven't heard anything about that yet, or maybe I missed it, but or if there's a reference you could give me where I could look that up and see what's been done, I'd certainly appreciate it. And I think a few other people here would too. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I can respond to your questions. The first question where you asked about the letter from the governor's office, we received that letter from the governor's office, and I think, there was a lot of really good information in there. They signaled that they were supportive of offshore wind and wanted to make sure that the engagement and outreach moving forward was done in a way that matched with how their perspective and, how they felt that the communities should be engaged. We've had quite a few conversations with the governor's office, and we have worked with them to develop the outreach and engagement strategy that we're doing on the draft wind energy areas. And, it's my understanding that they are supportive of the actions that we've taken since receiving that letter. And then in response to the question about ecological effects, I hear what you're saying, and, we've received similar comments that ask about, potential impacts from the, construction and the operation of such facilities. And we take those comments and those concerns very, very seriously. Specific to upwelling, I believe we are working on a future study looking at potential impacts and modeling what those would look like. And we have been working, there have been some models that have been done on offshore wind and upwelling, and we've been working very closely with the groups that put those studies together to try and really increase our understanding overall for what potential impacts would be. You know, we do find the time for that level of analysis, that detailed level of analysis, to really understand how these potential projects would impact the environment. We need to have more knowledge and more information about what the facility would look like. So at this point, where we're really looking about, you know, potential areas and consideration of the, you know, general process, it's not ripe for that detailed level of analysis, and that detailed level of analysis will occur before any decisions are made on offshore wind projects. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. I just want last comment is that we are very interested in that process and what's going forward. So if there's any way of updating in your engagement process, that would be a big lift for a lot of people. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I think Jessie is back with us, so I'm going to turn it back over to her. Jessie, you can see the hands raised. So, all yours.
Thanks, Carrie. I see the iPhone, who I think is Brian Blake.
Yes, this is a follow-up to Mike's question.
Hey, Brian, we can barely hear you.
How about now?
Much better.
All right, a follow-up to Mike's question. As you just said that it's not ripe to do those analysis. When it is ripe to do the analysis on the environmental impacts of operation of offshore wind on the West Coast, will that work be done looking at the cumulative impacts of offshore wind in all three states, or will it be done on an individual project basis? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. We do hear questions about cumulative impacts quite a bit, and so I am happy to provide information on that subject. And so we do a very detailed analysis of impacts at what's called the construction and operations plan submission. And so that would be after a lease has been issued and once we understand what the proposed facility looks like. So things that we need to know are, you know, how tall are the wind turbines? What is the rotor diameter? How is that wind turbine affixed to the seabed? What are the specific seabed conditions like at that facility? You know, what is the habitat like at that facility? And when we do review a construction and operations plan, we do consider cumulative impacts that are reasonable and foreseeable. And so we do consider cumulative impacts when we do that very specific and detailed analysis at the construction and operations phase.
But that would only be done on the individual wind areas projects, not the combined construction up and down the coast.
No, it considers all of the areas that have been leased or are when we do that analysis. So for example, we now have 5 lease areas off the coast of California. So, you know, if and when we receive a construction and operations plan for one of those, for a proposed facility on one of those lease areas, we will consider, you know, what is reasonable and foreseeable when we receive that plan. For example, East Coast projects, we have, throughout the United States, we have, I think, 32 active commercial leases right now. And so the construction and operations plans that are reviewed for projects on the East Coast, they do consider cumulative impacts that are reasonable and foreseeable, based on all of the submitted plans and leased areas. So we do consider cumulative impacts.
Thank you.
Okay, so at this point, I'm not seeing any other CPSAS hands based on some side conversations with David and Mike. I'd like to open, it sounds like I think we might open it up for a few public Q&As, excuse me, not public comment, question and answers only on the presentation. And we have like maybe 5 or 7 minutes for this. And then I do need to get to some CPSAS discussion. So the first hand I saw was Heather Mann.
Thanks, Jesse. Appreciate the opportunity. It's my understanding that the pause that was asked for by the state allowed the draft wind energy areas to be released, but with no commitment to move further than that. So can you tell me specifically, have you granted the pause, and are you waiting for the state to give you direction on whether to move to the leasing phase? Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. That's a great question. I think the first way to respond is, we are working close with the governor's office, and we have developed an engagement plan that the state supports. And I think that in hand in hand with the state, we are taking this one step at a time. And where we are right now is at the draft wind energy area comment stage, which, after we're soliciting information and comments on these draft wind energy areas. And then from that information that's received, there's another decision point on, to continue moving forward and to potentially refine the draft wind energy areas and establish final wind energy areas. I don't think we're at a place right now, because we haven't collected all those comments and all that information where we can say what the outcome will be. But what I can say is that we're working very closely with the state to try and make sure that all of the information is collected and considered, and as we move forward. Thank you.
Okay, the next hand I saw was Yelena.
Thanks, Jesse. I have 2 questions. Thanks for the presentation first. It was helpful. My first question is, I didn't quite catch whether scientific surveys layer was combined with submarine layer, or are they considered separately, incorporated separately? I guess I didn't understand that. And the second question, whether, well, clearly I didn't see the ecosystem layer. Is this something that you guys are planning to do? For example, the nurseries and the spawning grounds. Our understanding that there are some spawning grounds in the north part of the Coos Bay Coal area. So whether that will be part of the equation at some point that you expect. Thanks.
Thank you. Your first question, the scientific tables. So both of those data layers were in the industry and operations submodel. However, the submarine cables were not a data layer that was included in the scientific surveys combined data layer. So they were 2 separate data layers, just they were in the same submodel. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. And then, so your second question, about ecosystem data. So we, at this point in time, we don't have a data layer that you're asking about in the model currently. I'm not sure if we will at some point, if something comes up like during this comment period and the decision is made to rerun the model with new data, then that would be a time that maybe something like that would be included. But as of right now, that's not in the model.
Okay, thank you, Jess. Then can Jesse, is it okay if I ask a follow-up question to Jennifer?
Yeah, as long as it's brief, because I do want to get to Larry, and then we need to move on to CPSAS discussions.
You got it. Jennifer, so related to ecosystem layer, what would be then meaningful feedback that BOEM would take into consideration regarding the missing ecosystem layer and the spawning grounds that are in the area that you are putting the draft wind energy area over?
So I would say that if you have data about spawning areas that we are missing, please send it to us, because we are missing that information, as Jessica mentioned. We've reached out to everybody and to try to collect as much data and information as we can to go into the model. And so if we are missing something, please send that information, send a data link to Jessica or to myself, and we will consider that. And if it makes sense to add it to the model, we most definitely would do that.
Thanks.
Okay, and last question, and then we got to move on to the CPSAS. I saw Larry's hand go up a while ago, so I'm going to take that question and then need to move on to the CPSAS discussion. Again, noting that the MPC meeting is this Friday, and I think some more question and answer discussion might be happening then, unless I'm mistaken about that, Carrie.
So can you hear me all right? This is Larry Levick.
Yep, can hear you loud and clear, Larry.
So I have a couple questions. So relative to the suitability model, there is a category called protected species. That protected species relates, as far as I can see, to marine species. We have protected avian species, and I wanted to know how the specific protected avian species are being treated in the suitability model. And there was a term that was used that said that the bird mapping was dependent on what was called marine bird importance. And I'm not sure what importance means. Does it mean the density of occurrence of bird populations, or does it mean the importance of making sure that that protected species that may not have a high presence is protected, and then therefore would have a lower suitability score? The other question is on critical habitat. There is mapping that shows where the protected marine species have occurrence, I believe, is the way that is modeled. But I'd like to know how the critical habitat, which was designated, a year and a half ago, 2 years now, how that is specifically scored. And then on the cumulative impacts piece relative to what Brian Blake asked, it seems, and you can answer the question, that the cumulative impact analysis, which many of us would advocate can be done prior to COP, you are not going to do any serious cumulative impact analysis until after lease sales. And it seems that, the wind energy extraction that's proposed generally could be modeled without the specific technical descriptions of each turbine and where each one's going to be. So those are three areas that I have. I hope those were posed as questions and not comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. I'll take your first two questions about the data and the model here real quick. So for protected species, you're correct. Those were just marine mammals. So mammals and sea turtles. And so the birds were included in the marine bird combined data layer. And so that data layer took species density data, and that was for multiple seasons for each species. And so what was done was all of those species were combined into one layer that contained density data for all of those species. And then each species was given a vulnerability rating, which essentially weights that particular species in the layer potentially heavier than another one. So your comment about one, maybe it's not very dense, but it's highly vulnerable, then yes, that one would get more weighting and pull in that combined data layer. So the folks at the U.S. Geological Survey have a few papers out on some of this data. And so I would encourage you to check out Appendix G of the NCCOS report, and it walks you through the methods that were used in the marine bird combined data layer. And then also there's a table in there that contains all of the species and taxonomic groups that were included in that layer. And then second, your question about critical habitat. So for marine mammals and sea turtles, multiple things went into the decision for determining the data layers for each of the species that are in the protected species. And critical habitat and occurrence were things that were considered when the data layers were selected for each of the species that are in the protected species combined data layer. So let me know if I need to clarify any of that.
Well, just I was trying to get to, there are specific avian protected species. And if interaction with a particular protected species, short-tailed albatross, occurs at even minimal levels, that can cause regulatory modifications to the activity, fishing, for example. And it seems to me that within the suitability model, as you described, there doesn't seem to be a very significant recognition of the protected avian species and what the ramifications could be of interactions, and thereby making it less suitable for offshore development. That was the question relative to that. And in critical habitat, the question was, there are certain constraints that come with a designation of critical habitat, and such as that no federal project permitted or funded should occur within a critical habitat that has habitat modifying effects, such as forage fish availability, migratory behavior, there's water quality and acoustic noise, and it doesn't seem that there's much of a capture of those elements of that. You may not call it a constraint with a 0 score, but it's a barrier. It ought to be considered. So but otherwise, yes, thank you for the answers. And then the other question was about cumulative impact. Thanks.
Yeah, Jen, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one on cumulative impacts. And I think, Larry, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you are specifically referring to cumulative impacts to upwelling. or is it cumulative impacts in general?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And those are the questions we're not really looking to answer before we go ahead with lease sales. So there's a specific context. There's what is the hydrodynamic effects of offshore wind development generally understood, which includes things such as upwelling. Then the question is, what then does that do to the ecosystem potentially? There's the cumulative impact of a number of developments versus singular developments. So it seems to me we just haven't gone very far down the path to understand cumulative impacts. And what I'm getting from the statements that you made were, we're not going to do any of that until we have, how high the turbine is and how many there are, which I think is way late in the process. And we're doing the lease sales prior. So my question, is we aren't asking the questions, or it seems to me I'd like to know more about what questions you are asking relative to that and when you're asking them. Thanks.
Thank you, Larry. I really appreciate that. And, I would say for some of those broad questions that are not specific necessarily to a project, but about broad understanding about impacts, we are continuing to do research and to study that. Specifically, when it comes to upwelling, we are looking into, getting more understanding about potential impacts to upwelling with the installation of offshore wind projects. So that is something that we are considering and are actively pursuing right now to increase our understanding of. And then when it comes to cumulative impacts from specific projects, I think that's where we're waiting for that project specific information. So when you're thinking about, how does, the accumulation of impacts affect the environment, that is something that we will definitely assess at each step along the way as we find that it's appropriate. The offshore wind leasing process is long and complicated, and a big driver for that is because these facilities are built underwater. And I don't have to tell anybody on this call how unpredictable the ocean can be and how little it feels like we know about it at times, although we have increased our knowledge tremendously over the last 20, 30 years, exponentially. And so our process tries to take into consideration all of the risks and the time and the information that's needed to collect to really do a thorough evaluation of impacts. And it's our understanding to really know the impacts of a facility. You have to know what the ground conditions are like. You have to know the facility that is being planned to be installed, because the materials and the design can have an impact on those impacts. They could, whether we're talking a tension leg platform or a drag embedment anchors, or how tall the wind turbines are, or even specific materials on the moorings can have different entanglement impacts to marine life. And so that's why we do feel that we do need to know quite a bit of detailed information, and that the construction and operations phase is really when that project is reasonably foreseeable and we understand enough information to do a very detailed analysis and consider cumulative impacts for things that are in the pipeline. So thank you so much for that comment, and we will continue to learn more and to consider cumulative impacts, and how best to include them in our process as we move forward. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I just want to take a second and thank everyone for joining us for this overview. I know it was short notice, but like Carrie and I mentioned, this has been recorded. Additionally, I wanted to check in with Jennifer and others. Would it be okay to post that slideshow? And if so, can you send it to Carrie?
Yes, we can definitely post it, and we can send it to Carrie. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. So at this point, I'm going to suggest that David and Mike, we move into the CPSAS discussion. Members of the public, again, thank you so much for joining us. If you're more than welcome to stay on and listen to discussion about the CPSAS on marine planning and some other issues. But now we're going to kind of move into this to the next part of just our CPSAS meeting.
Well, I suggest we might need or want a 5-minute break or a 10-minute break. Subject to David's opinion.
Yeah, no, that would be fine, I think. And then we can get into give everybody else a chance to either, leave the call if they want, and then we'll regroup and have our discussion in, let's say, 10:25.
Okay, we'll see everybody back here in a few minutes.
Thanks.